Okay, so we've got our blog post form. Let's go ahead and do one more little test here. I'm going to say gum is great, category is gum, and I've got my content here. So I can go ahead and submit the form, and you'll see that it's successfully created a blog post here. But there's one weird thing about creating a post. When we submit the form, the user doesn't really get any navigation. They don't really get any feedback that says, hey, we just created your blog post. They don't want to be sitting here looking at the network request tab. So what we want to do is whenever the user clicks submit and the post is successfully created, we should navigate the user back to the list of posts, back to the index view. So far, we've done navigation through the use of link tags. So we placed a link tag and the user can click on the tag and automatically get navigated somewhere. This situation is a little bit different though. We don't want to make the user have to click a button to navigate around. We want to navigate for them. And to be clear, we're not going to replace the button here with the link tag. We only want to navigate the user when the post is successfully created. So what that means is we need to somehow programmatically navigate the user around our application. To do this, we're going to make use of React Router. React Router has a built-in method called push. We can call push with a new path, and the router will automatically navigate to that path and update the URL in the address bar. The only funny thing about this method is how we get used to it, or excuse me, how we get access to it. And so that's what we're going to be doing inside of this section. I'm here inside of the post new component, which is where we actually submit our form here and call the action creator to create the post. So this component right here would probably be a pretty good location to locate our helper method that is going to navigate the user around the page. So again, the only challenge here is getting access to that helper method push from React Router. Getting access to the router is done through a property on our component called context. Context in React is a lot like props. It is information that is passed from some parent component to a child component. The difference between context and props, however, is that context doesn't have to be deliberately passed from parent to child. In other words, when we normally create a component inside of an existing one, let's say that our post new component creates a div right here, we're passing props into the div, and we're very explicit about it. We say make this div and pass this information into it, right? Context works a little bit differently. We don't have to specifically pass context into a child component. The child component can just say, hey, I want to get access to this information that's sitting on context from some parent component. It reaches out and it just grabs it. So it's a very easy way to access data throughout the application without explicitly passing it. Now, having said that, I want to tell you right now, full stop, do not abuse context in your own applications. In fact, you should really avoid using context as much as possible. The only time you should really ever be working with context is specifically when we're working with React Router. The reason for this is that the context API is still in flux and it might change in a future release of React. So with that said, let's give this a shot. The first thing we need to do inside of our component to get access to context is to make sure that we can access it by defining a context types property. So above our render component, our render method here, we're going to write a static declaration on this class. So bear with me here for a second. Let's write it, and then we'll go ahead and talk about it. So we're going to write static context types, and then an object, router prop types dot object. And then up here inside of our React import statement, after a component, we're also going to pull off prop types. Okay, so this is looking pretty weird. Basically what's happening here is it is defining an object on the post new class. So if we wanted to, we could make reference to, say, post new dot context types, and then it would return this object right here. React interprets this object whenever an instance of post new is created. It's going to see that we declared some context types, and it's going to see that we want to specifically get access to some property on our context called router right here. React is then going to search all of this component's parents until it finds a component that has a piece of context called router. And in this case, it's going to go all the way back up to our router inside of our index file right here. And this router is going to provide the context for us. So again, this is really just giving us access to a property called this.context.router inside of our component. So again, it's like props, just a little bit different. We have to declare, hey, I want access to this router property. Please go check through all of my parents until you find it. And when you find it, assign it to this.context.router inside of the component. Okay. Again, just let me say it one more time. Try to avoid using context in general. The only time we really want to be using it is when we're working with the router right here. So now that we've got an instance of the router, and the router is what we use to call the push method, which is going to update our current path, we need to basically figure out a good location to update the URL. And so we really want to do that whenever our handle submit action is called. So let's go ahead and we'll pull out our handle submit to a separate helper function. So from now on, we're not just going to directly call create post right here. Instead, we'll move it into a helper function. So I'm going to make a new function called onSubmit, and it will be called with props. And then inside of it, we'll call this .props.createPost with props. So now instead of directly calling our action creator right here, I'm going to call our function, our helper function, onSubmit. So we do have a callback here, right? A callback function that we're going to pass over here, and it has a reference to this, which means we need to bind the context of our function here. I'm going to bind the context of the function right inside of here by using the bind keyword. So I'll say this onSubmit.bind this. Okay, so I know that this code probably looks very strange, probably a lot different than what we just had, but trust me, it's exactly the same. We've basically got the same exact thing here. Whenever handle submit is called, it's going to call this.onSubmit and pass in properties from the form. So this props object right here is not this.props, it's properties from the form. It's our content, our title, our categories. And so we're just going to take those properties and hand them off to our create post action creator. So it looks a little bit different, but trust me, it's the same thing. So again, nothing's really changed here. So even though that seems kind of strange, what we're going to do next is also going to seem a little bit weird, but again, just bear with me. Create post is an action creator that creates a promise as its payload, right? Whenever we call an action creator that creates a promise as a payload, this call right here will return that same promise. So when that promise is resolved, it means that our blog post was successfully created. That makes it the perfect location to make sure that our navigation occurs. So what we're going to do is chain on a .then statement on here. And then we'll pass in a function that will be called whenever the promise successfully resolves. In other words, when our blog post is successfully created. Then right in here, inside of this function means, let's add a comment in here just to make sure it's nice and clear. Blog post has been created. Navigate the user to the index. And then we're going to say we navigate by calling this.context.push, this.context.router.push with the new path to navigate to. So we'll say this.context.router.push, and we're going to go back to our index view, which is just /, like so. Okay, let's give this a shot in the browser, make sure that it works, and then let's come back here and do one more review on the changes that we've made here in this section. So I'm going to open up my browser. Let's say soda. Actually, I don't like soda. Let's do water. Water is great. Drinks. And we'll submit. Okay, and you'll see we just got automatically navigated back to our index view right here. But the post was also successfully created. You can see that I've got a post with a 201, which means, hey, we successfully created the blog post. So it looks like it worked. Let's talk about why it worked one more time. So to navigate around our app programmatically, like without a link tag, we need access to React Router, which is available to all components inside of our application through the context property. To get access to React Router, we had to define a context type right here. This tells React, hey, I want access to this property from a parent component. We then pulled the submission action out to a separate helper function right here called onSubmit. We called our action creator, createPost, which returned a promise, and then we chained onto that with a .then. So this inner function right here is only called when the blog post is successfully created. Once the blog post is successfully created, we called our router with this.context.router.push, and we added a new path for the router to automatically navigate over to. In this case, / represents the index page, so our user gets navigated back to the index page whenever the blog post is successfully created. That's it. Okay, so I think that about wraps up our add post form. We can create posts, we can cancel, and we can submit, which automatically takes us back to our list of blog posts over here. I think this is looking pretty good. Let's go ahead and continue in the next section.